If you really understand this story, your life will change. Ibrahim alayhi salam was once with his wife Hajar, and he basically left her at Mecca where there was no people and basically no water with very little food. And Hajar had no one with her except her son Ismail alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam went out and left on his own way. So Hajar called out to him and she basically asked, "To whom are you going to leave us with?" So Ibrahim alayhi salam responded, "I'm leaving you to Allah's care." And then look at this. Hajar responded, "I am satisfied with Allah's care." Now I'm not going to get into the rest of this story, but if you know it, this is basically the origin story of a lot of the rituals of Hajj. Like for example, Safa and Marwa. And this is where Zamzam water comes in. Because Hajar was left in a place with basically no water, with very little food, and just with her baby son. But what happened was she trusted Allah, and Allah basically gifted her with water through the Zamzam well. And so this story highlights one of the most powerful mindsets you need to have as a Muslim, which is that you need to rely on Allah only. Because Hajar's success only came from Allah. It was not because of what she did, it was because of what Allah gave her. If you look at certain people nowadays, you'll see that they're dependent on a lot of other people. Now, of course, there's things like your parents, but as much as possible, you should try to be independent. In fact, you should go as far as to not even ask people for things to the best of your ability. Now, of course, there's exceptions, but there's actually many hadiths about not asking people for things, not being a beggar, but instead working for yourself. For example, the Prophet ﷺ talked about how it's better for you to carry a rope and a bundle of wood and sell that wood in order to preserve your dignity than to beg on the street. And it's all about dignity, right? It's all about being independent. And the Prophet ﷺ also ordered Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu not to ask people for anything. And it would get to the point where he would drop something from his camel. He wouldn't ask anyone to pick it up for him and give it to him. He would literally make the camel kneel down and pick it up himself. This is one of the most fundamental pillars of Islam, and being a strong Muslim is having independence. And I would even say it's one of the most important pillars of masculinity in Islam. And if you look at what the Prophet ﷺ said, you'll understand that there's a lot of honor in being independent, right? Because when you're dependent on people, like it or not, people are just going to start looking down on you. Your honor is going to go down, your status is going to go down, because you seem like that person that's always dependent on someone, instead of being that person who makes an honest living working for himself and working hard. Now here's the thing, I actually avoided using the word self-sufficient specifically, because this is a very common misconception, even among Muslims. People have this idea that independence is self-sufficiency, but that's actually not true, because if we're being honest, you can't do anything by yourself. It's all by Allah's will. So what true independence is not relying on anyone except Allah, only relying on Allah. And this is called tawakkul. And I actually saw this very interesting clip which is talking about why saying self-sufficiency or saying you should be self-sufficient is haram. It's not permissible, because you shouldn't be self-sufficient. No one's self-sufficient. Only Allah is able to give you anything. So you have to be reliant on Allah, not rely on yourself.
يعلم حينئذ أن الجاري في كلام الناس من قولهم يجب على الإنسان أن يثق بنفسه أنه لا يجوز، فإن الثقة بالنفس ممنوع منها شرعا، لأن العبد هنا يقول لا تكلني إلى نفسي طرفة عين، فلا يجعل للعبد لنفسه في نفسه ثقة، لأن نفس الإنسان لا تغني عنه شيئا.
Now, honestly, this is a difficult thing to do, right? Especially if you're not in a good situation. Maybe you're poor, maybe a calamity struck you, maybe you're just in a bad state of mind. There's a lot of things that can happen, but what you have to understand is that Allah is in control of it all. And because Allah is in control of it all, Allah will basically make for you a way. In fact, this is what Allah says in the Quran, which is that Allah will make for you a way if you fear Him, and if you trust Allah, He is actually sufficient for you. That means no matter what position you are in life, no matter, like, even if you're broke, bro, even if you have $0 in your bank account, if you trust Allah, then Allah will actually be sufficient for you. You won't need anything else. You won't need anybody else. You won't even need to beg, but instead Allah will give you what you need. And bro, look, this is not easy. Like, this is a very high level of iman you need to have. You need to have full tawakkul, full trust in Allah, and trust in Allah's plan. But I guarantee you, once you have this, it's like your whole life is figured out, bro. Like, it's like everything is simple. You don't have to rely on anyone else. You just have to rely on Allah and understand that Allah has already written everything for you. And this is also the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he basically says, if you're independent and you put your trust in Allah, then Allah will make you sufficient. So really, you don't need to be a beggar in the streets. Even if you have $0, you just need to beg to Allah first. So when you think about it like that, it's like, why even worry about anything? And if you think about it, all anxiety just comes from not trusting Allah. Because when you don't trust Allah, then you're worried about your future or you're worried about your past. When you trust Allah, you understand everything is written. You don't worry about what's in store for you for the future because Allah has it written, right? So what's the point in worrying? And the best part is when you give up begging, when you give up asking people for things and try and be as independent as possible, Allah will actually make things easy for you, right? Allah will not make it difficult for you. Sure, it might be a little difficult at the start, but when you really rely on Allah and trust Allah, then your life will become a lot easier. And a problem a lot of people struggle with is greed. And Umar radiallahu anhu noted this in one of his khutbahs where he actually explained that having greed is kind of the opposite of independence. See, what happens is when you're greedy, when you're materialistic, you're never going to be content with what Allah has given you. And if you're never content with what Allah has given you, then you don't really have tawakkul in Allah. Because Allah knows best what's good for you. So what He's given you is what's best for you. So when you're greedy, you're basically saying that Allah doesn't truly know what I need or that you know more than Allah. And of course, that's completely haram. So having this idea of greed is very destructive because it leads to you not being content. It leads to kind of a spiritual sickness because you're always going to be worrying. And that's why Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu actually said to his son, and he gave him advice that if you seek richness, seek it in contentment. Because if you're not content, then nothing can make you rich. And if you think about it, that's super true. Because you might see some people who are not given as much, right? They're given maybe lowly jobs and they don't have that much, but they at least have enough to feed themselves and their family, and they're good. You look at them and they seem like they're rich because they are content with what they have. But you see other people who are maybe very rich, but because they're not content with what they have, they don't seem rich, right? They seem poor, and their attitude is also very poor. And the craziest thing is, which you might not understand, but being content with what you have, trusting Allah, will actually increase you in wealth. Like, it'll actually make you more money. And not just money, but everything in terms of provision. So in terms of knowledge, in terms of your children, your family, and everything else. Now, this is counterintuitive, right? It doesn't really make sense, but I want you to actually try this. And this is something I learned when I tried to research more about du'as. See, your du'a is really only going to get accepted when you focus more on the du'a itself than really putting an emotional attachment to the result of the du'a. For example, if you're making du'a for a certain job and you put a really high emotional attachment to the job itself, you're basically saying that if I don't get this job, if I don't get my result of my du'a, then I'm doomed, right? I can't do anything. But this is completely contrary to trusting Allah and trusting what Allah has written for you. Instead, when you make du'a, you should not really put an emotional attachment to the result of the du'a, but rather put an emotional attachment to the du'a itself, because du'a itself is ibadah. So I want you to actually try this. Specifically, if you're a person who cares so much and puts a really high emotional attachment on wealth, on material things, just stop caring about it as much and stop putting as much of an emotional attachment on it. And what you'll realize is if you truly trust Allah and trust Allah's plan, that you'll actually get more. Like, you'll get more riches. So how do you become more content with what you have? Because let's be honest, it is kind of hard. If you see everyone who has riches and you have nothing, you're poor, then of course it's going to be kind of hard to be content. The main way you become content is through having tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you don't trust Allah and you don't trust Allah's plan, you're never really going to be content. And these are the things which are mentioned in the hadiths I cited earlier. But one of the best ways is to learn and get more knowledge specifically on stories. So for example, the story I mentioned in the beginning, or also the story of Musa alayhi salam, or also the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, where his people told him and forced him to burn in fire, but Allah basically made the fire cool for him, just because Ibrahim alayhi salam trusted Allah. Also, if you're materialistic and you have a really strong attachment, an emotional attachment to wealth and cars and all of this financial stuff, then what I would say is you actually want to lower your gaze. A lot of people only think lowering your gaze applies to the opposite gender, but this is not true. You should lower your gaze from anything that might cause you harm. For example, if you're constantly looking at supercars, at rich people things like luxury items, then naturally your heart is going to want that. And if you do the opposite, your heart is not going to want it as much. So of course, having these supercars and luxury items is not haram in itself. And if you want that, then that's good, but you should never place an emotional attachment on it. You should never really go out of your way, and especially go out of your way and disobey Allah to get these things. And the last thing I'll say is there's a specific dua for being content, which is Hasbi Allahu wa ni'mal wakeel. Anyways, that's all I have for this video. Don't forget to start making dua to Allah. Check out Clean Islamic Streetwear in the description. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.